Yuxi, the Temple of the King of Shu. Heaven and earth were so full of his martial spirit that 1,000 autumns later we still respect him. Though fate split the world into 3 kingdoms, in his the old Han coins were still accepted. With his able minister, he established his dynasty, but the son who followed him had not his father's wisdom. Saddest of all, his son's beloved dancing girls ended up performing in the palaces of Wei. So here we have a new poem. In this case, it's a new poem and a new author, Liu Yuxi. So let's start as usual by introducing Liu Yuxi. So he is not too well represented in this anthology. Liu Yuxi has 4 poems here. Liu Yuxi is one of the great Chinese poets, also philosopher and essayist, from the mid-Tang period. So you should be thinking about the first quarter of the 9th century. And Liu Yuxi is a little favorite of mine for reasons that I'm going to comment in a minute. So Liu Yuxi was a scholar official, as most of these poets. In 793, he passed the Jinshi examination. He had close relationships with another poet and writer we've already encountered, who was more important actually as a prose writer than as a poet, Liu Zongyuan. In fact, they both belonged to a group, a court clique, that was following Wang Shuwen, a courtier associated with the Emperor Shunzong. Now, when this court clique was disbanded because the emperor abdicated and his son came to power, and Wang Shuwen, this minister and patron for Liu Yuxi and Liu Zongyuan, was executed, Liu Yuxi was demoted and sent to remote provinces and banished. So after a few years, he came back from banishment in 815, but Liu Yuxi, he was quite a character. So just on returning to the capital, he wrote a poem. I'm not sure if that poem is included later in this anthology. I hope it is. The Peach Blossoms of Xuandu Temple, which was quite a direct satire of the politicians that had sent him into exile and displaced him for the previous 10 or so years. Of course, because of this poem, he was banished again immediately and sent again to the provinces, where he would spend at least, I think, a decade or so more. And later on, he again returned to the capital, and he again, once more, wrote another poem criticizing his exile, and so courting yet another exile, you could say. That was the poem Visiting Xuandu Temple Again. But I'm not sure if he got yet another piece of exile because of the second poem. If it was rather brief. He ended his life in relatively good positions. He was given some important sinecures at the imperial court, including the post of a mentor or tutor of the heir to the throne, and so on. So, in spite of his exiles, quite a relatively successful life as a scholar official. Now, one important thing is during his exile, he was sent to provinces in the south, and he wrote a lot of poems inspired in the folk songs of these ethnicities in the south of China that were not completely assimilated to the majority Han culture and society. The bamboos, I think they're called the bamboo songs. He wasn't just a poet, he has an important production as a philosopher and essayist. Those essays also affect his poetry. He has a lot of history poems which are lessons in the style of the Western Latin Cicero's Historia Magistra Vitae, historical precedents giving examples of what to do and what to avoid in the past. And I think this poem that we have today could be read in that vein as a historical lesson. And this wasn't that unusual in Chinese scholar officials. Almost all of their poems which have a historical background are generally meant to be in the Chinese style of poetry as indirect political criticism of the present. Okay then, so this poem is, let's go to the poem now that we've introduced Liu Yuxi. And I said he's a petty hobby horse of mine, and like other Tang poets, I'm not aware that he has been translated to any extent in the West. Apart from the 4 poems in this anthology, there are a few in other anthologies, but no monographic translation has been made of Liu Yuxi's poem, and I really lament it. As soon as one comes out, I will be the first one to buy it. So this poem is dedicated to the temple of the King of Shu. Now, which King of Shu are we talking about? So the topic of this poem is mainly historical. It's evoking a figure from the past. The King of Shu is meant to be Liu Bei. Now, Liu Bei was one of the rulers of the Three Kingdoms period. When the Han Dynasty collapsed at the beginning of the 3rd century, ending up a period of almost 400 years of imperial union and prosperity, China was plunged into a new situation, the period of disunion, which would last almost 400 years until the Tang. Now, the first part of this period, from let's say 200 Anno Domini to about 280 or so, is the period that is known as the Three Kingdoms period, because the old Han Empire basically fractured into 3 different kingdoms. The greatest one in the north was the Cao Wei kingdom, controlled by the warlord Cao Cao and his descendants. There was another one in the southeast, below the Yangtze River Valley. This was the Wei. The one in the west was Shu. Wu. This was the kingdom of Wu, ruled by the warlord Sun Quan. And finally, there was in the west, basically in the area of Shu, but with some other adjacent territories, the kingdom of Liu Bei. And that 3rd king, Liu Bei, is the one that is praised in this poem. Now, Liu Bei was a member of a collateral branch of the previous Han ruling dynasty. So you could say that his, out of the 3 kingdoms, was the one with the greatest claim, perhaps, to legitimacy from the point of view of, the king of Shu being a scion of the previous imperial house. Against him, he had the fact that he was the weakest of the 3, controlling the poorest and probably the remotest territory of the three kingdoms. In later historiography, he was praised as a model, and one of the greatest of Chinese novels, which is from the 16th century, I believe, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, generally portrays Liu Bei as the hero, especially his minister, the warlike General Zhuge Liang, who's also referenced indirectly in this poem. And in that novel drinks from a tradition of plays and other texts that came before it. In that tradition, the state of Wei, which was the one that triumphed in the end, is generally portrayed as the villain and the corrupt state. So this poem is an idealization and praise of this good king from the past, the king of Shu, Liu Bei, and of his wise ministers, probably in the context in which Liu Yuxi is visiting a temple dedicated to the memory of Liu Bei, or perhaps of his minister, Zhuge Liang. We've already read a poem or 2 in this anthology about one scholar official, I'm not sure who he was, maybe Du Fu, visiting a temple to Zhuge Liang in Shu. Remember, Liu Bei ruled the state of Shu, and this area in the west of China was visited by many poets, and was the source of many poets as well. And after the Alishan rebellion, Du Fu lived there. Okay, so the topic is a good example from the past, a good ruler. But there is also a criticism of the ruler. As we will see when we read the last lines of the poem, there is a criticism, not so much at Liu Bei himself, but at the fact that his son was incompetent. And as an incompetent ruler, he lost his kingdom because of his dwelling in pleasure and superficiality. His kingdom was destroyed by the state of Wei, and his concubines and wives were all taken to the capital of the rival state. So this is a sad, melancholy topic. I believe that probably here we have a bit of historical criticism of the present. Liu Yuxi, as I said, lived during the mid-Tang period. The mid-Tang period is mainly characterized between the years 805-820 by the reign of Emperor Xianzong. And Emperor Xianzong was, you could say, the last able Tang dynasty emperor. He managed to rally the empire behind him. He managed to crush most of the, not all, but almost all of the rebellious warlords in the eastern and northern part of the territory. During his reign period, which is, I think it's called the Yuan He era, the Tang dynasty made a bit of a comeback after the disastrous effects and aftermaths of the Anlushan rebellion. So there was an imperial restoration of sorts and of imperial power and prestige. The situation was relatively short-lived, though. After the murder of Emperor Xianzong in 820, he was killed by one of his eunuchs. From then on, from 820 until the collapse of the dynasty at the beginning of the 10th century, the dynasty, so for those last 70, 80 years, the nation and the empire and the dynasty were in decline. Incompetent rulers climbed the throne, natural disasters, rebellions started to proliferate all over the land. The situation just went downhill, downhill, downhill. The successors of Xianzong were pretty incompetent. They were not competent rulers at all. And perhaps Liu Yuxi, who continued being in power and in a position of ever greater prestige and power after the death of the Xiande emperor, he lived until 842, so at least 20-something years into the late Tang period, a period of, as I said, chaos, of infighting, of eunuch power at court, and so on and so forth. We might imagine that this poem is meant to be a lesson to whatever emperor was on the throne when the poem was written, and the message being your ancestors, including perhaps the Xiande emperor, were good and able rulers, but you, my lord, you, my current emperor, are pretty incompetent, and if you continue like this, the dynastic mandate is going to be lost. So this, again, I don't know when this poem was composed, but this could apply to all of the successors of Emperor Xianzong. His son and successor, Emperor Muzong, who reigned for 4 years, was pretty useless. A drinker, neglecting his duties as emperor, lots of internal corruption, and after 824, after his death, I think he was one of these many emperors who suffered from illnesses because of taking pills for achieving immortality. Anyway, after his death, the situation didn't improve at all. So it continued going downhill after his younger brother succeeding him, the Emperor Xuanzong. Okay, then, enough with so much background. Well, let's go to the poem itself and study, as usual, what it says couplet by couplet. Heaven and earth were so full of his martial spirit that 1,000 autumns later we still respect him. So the first couplet connects with the title, and it makes clear that we're speaking about the King of Shu. The King of Shu is not mentioned, but being at the temple of the King of Shu, who is this person that is an exemplar and a model from the past, who was full of martial spirit and who is still respected 1,000 years later? It's Liu Bei, the successful, or at least relatively successful, emperor and ruler. And 1,000 years is a hyperbole, but not that much of a hyperbole. It's 500 years actually. The Three Kingdoms period, and the time of Liu Bei would have been the early 200s, and the time of writing this poem would have been the early 900s. So that's 700 years, pretty near to the millennium. Though fate split the world into 3 kingdoms, in his the old Han coins were still accepted. So this is the idea that the legitimacy of the dynasty, of the Han Dynasty, which had so successfully ruled China and, carved and molded the whole of Chinese society as a united empire with a common culture. And, the Han success in creating common people and a common empire was so much so that even today the main ethnic group of China is called Han, the Han ethnicity. So even though this empire fell and split into three kingdoms, the kingdom of Shu remained as, the most legitimate and the most direct continuation of the Han. Old Han coins were still accepted because in theory, in the kingdom of Shu under Liu Bei, the Han dynasty continued. It hadn't been extinguished. Even though it was, Liu Bei was a descendant of a very, very collateral branch of the ruling house. He was, not a descendant of the last emperors of the Eastern Han. In fact, I think he was a descendant of the founder of the Eastern Han Dynasty, Emperor Wang Wu, but a very remote descendant. So the continuity, I again stress this idea of continuity perhaps is connected with the Han Lushan rebellion and its crisis. There was no dynastic change there either. The line of Tang emperors continued after the Han Lushan rebellion, but the parallelism is suggestive because the dynasty survived, but in a greatly diminished role and power. With his able minister, he established his dynasty, but the son who followed him had not his father's wisdom. So again, this is a praise and a recognition of the role of the great general Zhuge Liang, who was successful for the survival of the Shu Han state and some of its great military successes in managing to absorb territories in the west of China. But the contrast here is, very effectively introduced, the contrast that will be reflected upon in the conclusion as well. So we move now from the praise of Liu Bei to the censure of his descendants. So his son had not his father's wisdom. This is, a common event in Chinese history, and it becomes almost a myth how, founding dynasties are founded by good, well, strong, intelligent emperors. But of course, in any hereditary system of rulership, where the main son, or the firstborn, or at least one of the sons, gets to the throne just because he is the son of the emperor, it's inevitable that after time incompetent figures will rise to the emperorship. In an absolute monarchy, even though in practice this was not so much so in some periods of Chinese history, but an incompetent ruler will, bring trouble to the dynasty, and he might even provoke its collapse. And that's a typical story that appears in Chinese poems and in the scholar officials' admonitory advice to emperors, like, you're not being good like your ancestors, you're going to lose the mandate. So this is the idea here. So the emperor was able, he listened to able ministers, always a favorite idea of Confucian scholars in the poems. Good rulers should listen to good ministers. But the sons undoing what their fathers did by their corruption and debauchery also appears a lot. And it appears here as, what happened to the king of Shu. His son was not worthy. His son just, led himself to pleasure and lost his kingdom. The last couplet really hammers this point in. Saddest of all, his son's beloved dancing girls ended up performing in the palaces of Wei. Remember, the greatest state in the north in the Three Kingdoms period was the state of Cao Wei, which wasn't very long lived. So very early on, already in the 230s, 240s, the Wei rulers of the northern dynasty had become puppets and figureheads and were being controlled by the Sima clan, who would eventually, after conquering Shu and Wu, establish a new dynasty and depose the Wei rulers. And this was the Jin dynasty, which very briefly managed to unify China during a period of 20-30 years, which is the only period of unification in the 400 centuries of the period of disunion. But anyway, the idea is, as we said, the son of the ruler was incompetent. So the worst thing that could happen. His wives, his favorite concubines, had to dance in the court of the enemy king, becoming the wives, the slaves, the concubines of his rival. So, melancholy, sad ending, and also a warning and an admonition, I would say, to his own present ruler. If you don't want your women to become the concubines of somebody else, start ruling effectively and listening to the advice of scholar officials. So, quite a nice poem and quite a change from the ones we've been reading lately.